May 8, 1945. North Atlantic Ocean. Captain Lieutenant Klaus Bargston stood in the conning tower of U-521, watching the gray Atlantic waves roll past. The radio message from Grand Admiral Dönitz had been brief and unmistakable. Cease all offensive operations. Surface, fly black flags, and proceed to designated ports for surrender. The war was over. Germany had capitulated. For nearly 6 years, German U-boats had waged unrestricted submarine warfare across the Atlantic. They had sunk thousands of Allied merchant ships and hundreds of warships. They had come within striking distance of winning the Battle of the Atlantic and cutting Britain off from American supplies. U-boat crews had been the elite of the Kriegsmarine, volunteers who knew the risks but believed in their mission and their boats. Now Bargston was being ordered to surface his submarine in broad daylight, fly a surrender flag, and steam toward a port where enemy forces would take possession of his boat. Everything he had trained for, everything he had risked his life for over countless patrols, was ending not in combat but in surrender. The humiliation burned, but orders were orders. Around him, his crew prepared to comply, their faces showing the same mixture of relief and defeat that Bargston felt. Across the Atlantic, similar scenes were playing out on dozens of German submarines. Boats that had hunted Allied shipping were now vulnerable prey, surfaced and defenseless, making their way toward surrender points. Some commanders would comply with orders, others would refuse. A few would make different choices that ended in tragedy. The story of how German submarines surfaced to surrender in the Atlantic is not a single event but a complex process that unfolded over weeks. It's a story of obedience and defiance, of survival and self-destruction, and of how the most formidable submarine force in history came to an ignominious end. To understand the surrender, you need to understand what came before it. The U-boat war began on the first day of World War II when U-30 torpedoed the passenger liner Athenia, killing 117 people including 28 Americans. The sinking was a mistake. The U-boat commander thought Athenia was an armed merchant cruiser, but it set the tone for a war that would see no distinction between military and civilian targets at sea. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who commanded the U-boat force and later became Grand Admiral commanding all German naval forces, believed that Germany could win the war by strangling Britain's maritime supply lines. Britain imported most of its food, all of its oil, and much of the raw materials for its industry. Cut those supply lines, and Britain would be forced to negotiate peace. The theory was sound. The execution would prove extraordinarily difficult. The early U-boat war from 1939 to mid-1940 saw modest success. U-boats operated individually, hunting merchant ships in the approaches to British ports. The sinkings were significant but not catastrophic. Britain's convoy system, developed during World War I, provided some protection for merchant shipping. U-boats found it difficult to attack escorted convoys with the tactics and weapons available. The fall of France in June 1940 transformed the strategic situation. Germany gained access to Atlantic ports in occupied France. U-boats no longer had to transit through the North Sea and around Britain to reach their patrol areas. They could operate from Brest, Lorient, and other French ports, dramatically increasing their time on patrol and their effectiveness. The period from mid-1940 through 1941 became known among U-boat crews as the happy time. The Wolfpack tactics Dönitz developed exploited the U-boat's advantages. Rather than attacking convoys individually, multiple U-boats would coordinate attacks, overwhelming the escorts and sinking numerous merchant ships before the escorts could respond effectively. The tactics required radio communication to coordinate submarine positions, but the Germans believed their Enigma cipher machines made those communications secure. The tonnage of Allied shipping sunk by U-boats peaked in 1942 at over 6 million gross tons. In that year, U-boats were sinking ships faster than Allied shipyards could replace them. If the trend continued, Britain's situation would become untenable. The Battle of the Atlantic hung in the balance, with the outcome uncertain. U-boat crews were volunteers selected for intelligence, psychological stability, and physical fitness. Life aboard a U-boat was extraordinarily difficult. The boats were cramped, with crews of 40 to 50 men living in spaces barely large enough to function. The air was foul, contaminated with diesel fumes, body odor, and the smell of unwashed men. Fresh water was scarce, used primarily for drinking and cooking rather than washing. Patrols lasted weeks or months, with crews enduring constant stress and periodic terror when attacked by Allied anti-submarine forces. The dangers were immense. Depth charge attacks could crush a boat at any moment. Air attacks caught surface U-boats vulnerable, mines lurked in approach channels. Mechanical failures could trap boats underwater or prevent them from diving when attacked. The casualty rate among U-boat crews was the highest of any branch of German military service. Of approximately 40,000 men who served in U-boats during the war, about 30,000 died. The 75% fatality rate was staggering. Yet morale remained remarkably high through 1942. The crews believed in their mission. They saw their successes, the merchant ships torpedoed and sunk. They trusted Dönitz, who had himself commanded U-boats in World War I and understood their experiences. They took pride in being an elite force executing a critical mission. The losses were mourned but accepted as the price of war at sea. The Battle of the Atlantic began turning against the U-boats in 1943, through a combination of factors that progressively eliminated the submarines' advantages. Technology, tactics, numbers, and intelligence all shifted in favor of the Allies. The breaking of German naval enigma by British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park gave Allied naval commanders unprecedented insight into U-boat operations. Decrypted messages revealed U-boat positions, patrol areas, and plans. Convoy routing could be adjusted to avoid Wolfpacks. Anti-submarine forces could be directed to areas where U-boats were operating. The intelligence advantage was decisive, though its full impact wouldn't be recognized until after the war when the ultra-secret was finally revealed. Technological advances multiplied Allied advantages. Radar systems became small enough to fit on aircraft and could detect surface to U-boats at night or in poor visibility conditions. Lee lights allowed aircraft to illuminate targets during the final approach for attack. More sophisticated sonar systems improved detection of submerged U-boats. High-frequency direction finding, HFDF or HFDUF, allowed Allied ships to locate U-boats by their radio transmissions. Aircraft closed the air gap in mid-Atlantic where previously no land-based aircraft could reach. Long-range B-24 Liberators and other patrol aircraft extended coverage over convoy routes. Escort carriers accompanied convoys, providing air cover throughout the voyage. U-boats that had previously been safe in mid-ocean now faced air attack anywhere in the Atlantic. Weapons improved as well. Forward-throwing Hedgehog mortar allowed escorts to attack submarines without losing sonar contact during the attack run. More powerful depth charges with better fusing destroyed U-boats more effectively. Acoustic homing torpedoes targeted submarines' propeller noise, making evasion more difficult. The numbers shifted decisively. Allied shipbuilding, particularly in American yards using mass production techniques, began replacing sunk tonnage faster than U-boats could sink it. The Liberty ships, though slow and ungainly, were produced in extraordinary numbers. By mid-1943, the tonnage balance had shifted. Merchant ships were being built faster than they were being sunk. Meanwhile, U-boat losses increased dramatically. In May 1943, 43 U-boats were sunk, a catastrophic loss rate that forced Dönitz to temporarily withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The U-boats had been defeated, at least temporarily, in their primary operational area. While they would return with new technologies and tactics, they never again achieved the dominance they had held in 1942. The introduction of the snorkel breathing tube in 1944 allowed U-boats to run diesel engines while submerged at periscope depth, reducing vulnerability to air attack. But the snorkel brought its own problems. Running submerged was slower. The tube could be detected by radar. The boats were still vulnerable to improved sonar detection. The technological balance had shifted against the U-boats, and snorkels weren't enough to restore their effectiveness. New U-boat types were in development. The Type 21 was a revolutionary design with streamlined hull form, large battery capacity, and high submerged speed. It could have changed the nature of submarine warfare. But production delays, Allied bombing of shipyards, and material shortages meant that no Type 21 ever conducted a combat patrol before the war ended. The technological promise remained unfulfilled. By 1945, U-boat operations had become increasingly desperate. The sinking rates were far below the 1942 peak. Losses continued to mount. Crews still went on patrol because orders demanded it, but the sense of impending defeat was palpable. Younger crews lacked the experience of veterans lost in earlier years. Training was compressed as Germany's manpower situation deteriorated. Boats went to sea commanded by officers and crewed by men who would have needed more preparation in earlier years. The final months of the U-boat war were characterized by diminishing returns at escalating costs. Boats that managed to reach operational areas found Allied defenses so strong that successful attacks were rare. The transit to and from patrol areas became increasingly dangerous as Allied anti-submarine forces improved their coverage. Many boats were sunk in the Bay of Biscay or Norwegian coastal waters before reaching the Atlantic. Dönitz knew the situation was deteriorating. He had argued for continuing the U-boat campaign, not because he believed it could win the war but because tying up Allied anti-submarine forces prevented those forces from being used elsewhere. Every escort destroyer hunting U-boats was a destroyer that wasn't supporting an amphibious landing or protecting carriers. The strategic justification was thin, but it provided rationale for continuing operations that were costing German crews their lives at appalling rates. On May 4, 1945, Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedberg signed the surrender of all German forces in northwest Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. Hitler had committed suicide on April 30th. The collapse was complete. Grand Admiral Dönitz, Hitler's designated successor, was attempting to negotiate surrender terms that would allow as many German soldiers and civilians as possible to reach Western Allied lines rather than Soviet capture. On May 7, Germany signed unconditional surrender documents that would take effect on May 8. All German military forces were to cease offensive operations immediately and surrender to Allied authorities. This included the U-boat fleet, still numbering over 150 boats at sea or in port. Dönitz transmitted orders to all U-boats. Cease offensive operations immediately. Surface. Fly black flags or triangular black pennants, transmit position reports on designated frequencies, and proceed to designated Allied ports for surrender. U-boats in German or occupied ports were to remain there and await Allied occupation forces. The orders were explicit and allowed no discretion. For U-boat commanders at sea, the orders created impossible situations. They had spent years training to avoid surfacing in hostile waters. Every instinct screamed against the order to surface in broad daylight and make themselves targets. Yet orders were orders, and the German naval tradition emphasized obedience. Some commanders complied immediately. They surfaced, transmitted position reports, and began steaming toward designated surrender ports. The psychological impact on crews was devastating. Men who had survived years of combat, who had seen friends die, who had lived through depth charge attacks and air attacks and countless dangers, now faced the humiliation of surrender. Some wept openly. Others expressed relief that the war was finally over and they would survive. Many felt conflicting emotions simultaneously. Other commanders delayed compliance. They destroyed sensitive equipment, including Enigma machines and codebooks, before surfacing. Some jettisoned remaining torpedoes or fired them at distant targets to empty the tubes. A few destroyed classified documents despite orders to preserve them for Allied intelligence. These actions violated the spirit of the surrender orders, but seemed necessary to maintain some shred of operational security. Several commanders refused to comply at all. They chose to scuttle their boats rather than surrender them to the enemy. The scuttling procedures were well established: open sea valves, set demolition charges, evacuate crew to lifeboats or rafts, detonate charges. The boats would sink in deep water where they couldn't be salvaged. The crews would become prisoners, but at least their boats wouldn't fall into enemy hands. U-530, commanded by Otto Wermuth, took a different approach. Rather than surrender to British or American forces, Wermuth decided to sail to Argentina. The boat crossed the Atlantic submerged as much as possible to avoid detection and arrived in Mar del Plata, Argentina on July 10, 1945, more than 2 months after the surrender. The Argentine authorities interned the crew and eventually turned the boat over to the United States. U-977, commanded by Heinz Schäfer, also fled to Argentina, arriving on August 17, 1945. Schäfer's stated motivation was to avoid Soviet captivity and to give his crew time to consider their options. The boat's late arrival fueled decades of conspiracy theories about U-boats evacuating Nazi officials to South America, though no evidence ever substantiated these claims. The majority of U-boats complied with surrender orders. By mid-May 1945, Over 150 U-boats had surfaced and were proceeding to surrender ports or remained in harbor awaiting Allied occupation. The locations varied. Some went to British ports, some to American bases in Germany or captured French ports. Some remained in Norwegian harbors to surrender to Allied forces there. The question of what to do with the surrendered U-boats created diplomatic complications. The Soviet Union demanded a share of the boats as war reparations. Britain, which had suffered most from U-boat attacks, wanted to ensure the boats were destroyed rather than allowing any nation to acquire a ready-made submarine fleet. The United States had less direct interest but supported Britain's position that the boats should be eliminated. The diplomatic negotiations resulted in Operation Deadlight, the code name for the systematic destruction of surrendered German U-boats. The operation would dispose of most of the boats by towing them to deep water off Scotland and sinking them by gunfire or torpedo. A few boats would be preserved for technical evaluation or museums, but the majority would be destroyed. The operation began in November 1945 and continued into early 1946. U-boats were gathered at Loch Ryan in Scotland and formed into groups for disposal. Royal Navy destroyers, frigates, and submarines were assigned to conduct the sinkings. Polish and Norwegian naval forces also participated, given those nations suffering under German occupation. The sinkings were methodical but not always straightforward. U-boats were designed to withstand significant damage, and simply opening fire on a surfaced empty U-boat didn't always sink it quickly. Some boats required multiple torpedo hits. Others were riddled with gunfire that holed the pressure hull but still took hours to sink. A few broke loose from tows and storms and had to be hunted down and sunk before they drifted into shipping lanes. The crews assigned to sink the U-boats had mixed feelings. Some relished the opportunity to destroy the boats that had sunk Allied shipping. Others found the task anticlimactic, almost unsporting, shooting at unmanned targets that couldn't shoot back. The systematic destruction of sophisticated machines felt wasteful to some participants, though the strategic logic was sound. In total, Operation Deadlight disposed of 116 U-boats. They were sunk in an area of the North Atlantic about 100 miles northwest of Ireland, in water approximately 3,000 feet deep. The wrecks remain there today, slowly corroding in the cold deep water, protected as war graves by international agreements. Some U-boats were spared Operation Deadlight for various reasons. Several were allocated to Allied navies for technical evaluation. The United States took several boats back to America for testing. The Soviet Union received several boats as reparations despite Western reluctance. France, which had suffered German occupation, also received boats. A few were preserved for museums or memorial purposes. U-995, which survives today as a museum ship in Germany, was originally allocated to Norway and served in the Norwegian Navy until 1965. U-2540, raised and recommissioned as the research submarine Wilhelm Bauer, also survives as a museum ship. These boats provide tangible connections to the U-boat war and serve as educational resources about submarine warfare. The destruction of the U-boat fleet marked the definitive end of German naval power. Germany had surrendered its surface fleet after World War I, and that fleet had been scuttled at Scapa Flow by its own crews. The U-boat fleet of World War II was systematically destroyed by its enemies, a more humiliating end that reflected Germany's total defeat. Behind the statistics of surrendered and scuttled boats were thousands of individual stories of men facing the end of the war they had fought. These stories reveal the complexity of the surrender and its impact on those who experienced it. Captain Lieutenant Adalbert Schnee, commanding U-2511, was returning from patrol when the surrender orders arrived. U-2511 was a Type 21 boat, the advanced model that represented the future of submarine warfare. Schnee had conducted a practice attack on a British cruiser just hours before receiving the surrender order, demonstrating that the Type 21 could have been a formidable weapon. He complied with orders, surfaced, and surrendered the boat to British forces. Schnee survived the war and later wrote about his experiences, becoming one of the more prominent U-boat commanders to publish memoirs. Corvettin Captain Karl Emmermann, commanding U-3503, chose to scuttle rather than surrender. On May 5th, before the official surrender, Emmermann brought his boat into shallow water off the Danish coast and scuttled it in water too shallow for salvage to be easy. He and his crew rowed ashore and surrendered to British forces there. Emmermann's decision reflected a desire to deny the Allies his boat while ensuring his crew's survival. Oberleutnant zur See Wolfgang Lt., one of Germany's most successful U-boat commanders, didn't live to see the surrender. Ltich was killed in a tragic accident on May 14, 1945, shot by a German sentry who mistook him for an intruder. Ltich survived years of combat patrols only to die in a senseless accident days after the war ended. His death highlighted the chaos of the immediate post-war period when military discipline was breaking down. Many U-boat commanders faced difficult decisions about their crew's fate. Surrendering to Western allies offered reasonable treatment as prisoners of war. Surrendering to Soviet forces might mean much harsher treatment or even execution. Some commanders deliberately maneuvered to ensure they surrendered to British or American forces rather than Soviets. Others had no choice based on their positions when surrender orders arrived. The youngest crews, men who had joined the U-boat service in 1944 or 1945, often felt relief at the war's end. They had experienced only the losing phase of the U-boat war and hadn't shared the earlier successes that older veterans remembered. Survival seemed more important than continuing a clearly lost cause. These younger men adapted to post-war life more easily than veterans who struggled with the memories of battles and lost comrades. The most experienced commanders and crews had the most complex emotional responses. They had fought for years, survived when so many of their comrades had died, and now faced surrender to enemies they had fought so hard against. The sense of failure was acute. Some developed psychological problems that affected them for the rest of their lives. Others managed to process their experiences and move forward, though the memories never faded. The families of U-boat crews faced their own ordeals. Many had received official notifications that their husbands, sons, or brothers were missing and presumed dead. When boats surrendered and crews returned, families experienced joy at reunions but also had to process the trauma of months or years of uncertainty. Some families never received closure, with men listed as missing whose boats' fates remained unknown for years or decades. The Allied sailors who took possession of surrendered U-boats had varied reactions. Some were curious about the technology and impressed by the boat's capabilities. Others felt contempt for the Germans who had sunk so many Allied ships. Physical confrontations were rare, but tensions were obvious. The surrender process brought former enemies face to face in circumstances where emotions ran high. The surrender of the German U-boat fleet marked not just the end of a campaign, but the end of an era in naval warfare. The U-boats of World War II represented the culmination of a particular approach to submarine warfare. Boats that operated primarily on the surface, diving only to attack or evade threats. The post-war era would see submarines transition to true submersibles, capable of remaining underwater for extended periods. The technical intelligence gathered from captured U-boats influenced post-war submarine development. The Type 21's streamlined hull form and large battery capacity pointed the way toward future designs. American and Soviet submarine development in the late 1940s and 1950s drew heavily on German innovations. The U-boats' final contribution to naval warfare came not through their combat operations but through the technical knowledge their capture provided. The human cost of the U-boat war was staggering. Of approximately 40,000 German submariners, 30,000 died. The 75% casualty rate exceeded that of any other branch of German military service. The Allied merchant seamen suffered similarly. Over 30,000 Allied merchant sailors died, most in U-boat attacks. The Battle of the Atlantic was among the war's deadliest campaigns for both sides. The strategic impact remains debated. U-boats came close to cutting Britain's Atlantic lifeline in 1942-1943. Had they succeeded, Britain might have been forced to negotiate peace or at least accept less favorable terms. But they didn't succeed. The combination of technological advances, cryptanalysis, increased Allied production, and improved tactics defeated the U-boat threat by mid-1943. The final 2 years of U-boat operations inflicted damage but never again threatened Allied strategic objectives. Dönitz's argument that continuing U-boat operations tied down Allied anti-submarine forces had some merit. Every destroyer hunting U-boats was a destroyer not available for other missions. But the cost in U-boat crews was enormous for this strategic effect. Whether the trade-off was justified remains questionable. Dönitz himself would later express doubts about whether continuing operations after mid-1943 had been wise. The surrender process itself became a model for how defeated military forces could be disarmed. The systematic accounting for U-boats, the procedures for safe surrender, and the eventual disposal through Operation Deadlight established precedents. The process wasn't perfect, but it largely avoided the chaos that might have resulted from less organized procedures. The conspiracy theories that emerged about U-boats escaping to South America or Antarctica persisted for decades. The reality was mundane. A few boats fled to Argentina to avoid capture, but no evidence ever substantiated claims of senior Nazis escaping by submarine or of secret bases in remote locations. The mythology reflected post-war anxieties but not historical reality. For the Germans who served in U-boats, the post-war years brought challenges of reintegration into civilian life. Former submariners formed veterans associations that helped maintain connections among survivors. Reunions brought together men who had shared the unique experience of U-boat service. These organizations also worked to memorialize the fallen and preserve the history of the U-boat war. The relationship between former enemies gradually evolved. British and German U-boat veterans eventually participated in joint memorial services. The mutual respect that combat veterans often feel for their former adversaries developed over decades. The recognition that all were serving their nations and following orders helped bridge the animosities that combat had created. The day German submarines surfaced to surrender in the Atlantic was actually many days. A process that unfolded over weeks as individual boats received orders, commanders made decisions, and crews complied or defied those orders. The surrender marked the end of the longest continuous military campaign of World War II, a battle that had raged from the war's first day to its last. The U-boat war had been technologically sophisticated, tactically innovative, and strategically significant. It had consumed enormous resources on both sides. It had cost tens of thousands of lives. It had influenced the war's outcome in ways that counterfactual historians still debate. The U-boats never achieved the strategic objective of forcing Britain out of the war, but they came closer than many realize. The men who served in U-boats were volunteers who accepted extraordinary risks to serve their nation. They endured conditions that few could tolerate, faced dangers that killed the majority of their comrades, and fought with skill and determination even when the strategic situation was clearly hopeless. Their courage deserves recognition, even as their cause is rightly judged as serving an evil regime. The Allied sailors who fought against the U-boats displayed equal courage and determination. Merchant seamen continued sailing despite knowing their ships might be torpedoed at any moment. Naval personnel aboard escorts and patrol aircraft hunted submarines in conditions that were often dangerous and always uncomfortable. The victory over the U-boats was earned through technical innovation, strategic insight, and sheer perseverance. The breaking of German naval enigma by British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park contributed decisively to defeating the U-boats, though this contribution remained secret for decades after the war. The intelligence advantage allowed Allied naval commanders to route convoys away from wolf packs and to direct anti-submarine forces to areas where U-boats were operating. Without this advantage, the Battle of the Atlantic might have ended differently. The technological competition between U-boats and anti-submarine forces drove innovations that influenced post-war development. Radar, sonar, cryptography, submarine design, and anti-submarine weapons all advanced rapidly during the Battle of the Atlantic. The post-war naval forces of all major powers benefited from these wartime innovations. The surrender of the U-boat fleet eliminated a threat that had dominated Allied strategic thinking for 6 years. The relief felt by those responsible for protecting Atlantic shipping was profound. The knowledge that U-boats would no longer be hunting convoys allowed resources to be redirected to other pressing needs in the final stages of the war against Japan. For the German U-boat crews who surfaced to surrender, the moment marked the end of a chapter in their lives that had defined them. They had been U-bootfarer U-boat men, an identity that came with pride despite the service's terrible casualty rate. Surrender forced them to confront the reality that their service, their sacrifices, and their lost comrades had all been in service of a defeated cause. The black flags flying from conning towers symbolized more than just surrender. They represented the end of German naval power, the failure of the U-boat campaign to achieve its strategic objectives, and the transition from combat to captivity. For some commanders, raising that black flag was the most difficult order they ever executed. The day German submarines surfaced to surrender in the Atlantic didn't end the Battle of the Atlantic. That battle had effectively been lost by the U-boats in 1943, but it marked the official conclusion of the longest campaign of World War II. The surfacing U-boats, vulnerable and defenseless, stood in stark contrast to the deadly hunters they had been. The image of those black flags flying from submarines that had once terrified the Atlantic captured the totality of Germany's defeat and the price paid by all who fought in the Battle of the Atlantic.